Disney has a Walt problem. The man who started it all is today no different from Mickey Mouse or Moana, a character used by the Disney company to try and sell you things. In the over 55 years since Walt's passing, he has been slowly but surely sanitized and simplified to the point where the man in statues, in holograms, and even on stupid NFTs bears little resemblance to the true Walt Disney. After founding the Disney Brothers studio in 1923 with his brother Roy, from 1926 onwards, Walt Disney's name would be front and forward within the company, from the name change to the Walt Disney Studio. He was the driving creative force behind the company, surrounding himself with fellow creatives who could all make it happen. From the beginning, Walt and the Walt Disney Company have been inseparable. That would be further elevated when he began hosting weekly anthology television shows that also bear his name. Starting in 1954, Walt Disney's Disneyland would bring Walt himself into people's living rooms all across the United States. While most film studios were scared of television, Walt was willing to embrace it, mostly due to ABC's willingness to fund part of Disneyland in a trade-off for the weekly TV show. This show would see Walt host segments and introduce people to new movies, characters, and of course, the theme park. The 12 years that Walt would host these shows were the years that ingrained Walt Disney into the minds of countless people. He was no longer a behind-the-scenes creative, but old Uncle Walt, who would sit around and tell stories with you once a week. Of course, even in these early days, the public-facing Walt was a sanitized and characterized version of the real man. While the passion and creativity were all real, anyone on TV playing themselves is playing a version of themselves, the one that they or the TV studio wants you to see. Walt would never take to the camera smoking or union busting, for example. Walt's death on December 15, 1966 was unexpected and a shock to almost everyone. The Disney company no longer knew what to do without their leading man. They became a ship without a steering wheel. After the mourning period, a new mantra took over the Disney company. What would Walt do? The creatives wouldn't think for themselves, but would instead try to stand in Walt Disney's shoes and predict his opinions and feedback on projects. It became a mantra that would just as much guide the creatives in the company as it would freeze their decision-making abilities. Walt passed right before things ramped up on the construction of Walt Disney World and the looming plans for an experimental prototype community of tomorrow. So much of Walt's genius, though, was his unpredictability. The logical process after creating films wasn't to create theme parks, but that's what he did. And the logical progression from theme parks sure wasn't cities, but that's what he wanted to do. This era is the beginning of when we can see the Disney company treating Walt as more than a person, and instead as a set of rules and ideals that he may or may not have agreed with. One of the clearest dedications to Walt is obviously the partner statue. In 1962, Disney legend and sculpting genius Blaine Gibson sculpted the first bust of Walt Disney. However, he himself admits it wasn't very good, and when he presented it to Walt, all he said was, "What am I going to do with this? Statues are for dead people." Years after Walt's death, Gibson would try again, working on a memorial medal for Cal Arts that featured a headshot of Walt. But Walt's widow Lillian at the time wasn't happy, saying that she didn't ever want a bust or a portrait or a statue of Walt to be done. In 1981, to honor the 200th millionth guest at Disneyland, Disney legend Charles Boyer was commissioned to make a special lithograph titled Partners to honor both Walt and Mickey Mouse. Just a few years later, in 1984, Michael Eisner would come on board as CEO of the Disney Company, and in some ways would see himself as Walt Disney reincarnated. One of his first goals was to increase attendance at the Disney parks, and his method to do so involved limited time events that would overtake Disneyland. Promotions such as Blast to the Past would place a large jukebox in the center of the park, and Circus Fantasy would see a giant metal ball for motorcycles to ride around in, installed right in front of the castle. Longtime Imagineers hated these intrusions to the meticulously designed theme park, with Marty Sklar and John Hench being particularly annoyed. So they set out to find a permanent solution and stop the castle from being blocked ever again. The official pitch was that just 2 decades after his passing, Walt Disney was being forgotten. Kids today hadn't grown up with him on TV, and they had no idea who he was. With Eisner on board and Lillian Disney now happy to have her late husband immortalized in his family fun park, the partner statue was officially in production. Bringing back Blaine Gibson, plenty of ideas were floated, with one featuring Mickey pulling Walt along, another with Walt holding Epcot blueprints in his hand, and another with Mickey holding an ice cream cone. The final sculpt, though, featured Walt as he was in 1954, right before the opening of Disneyland, pointing out, admiring the park, and saying to Mickey, "Look what we've done." Beside the statue is a plaque that states, "I think most of all, what I want Disneyland to be is a happy place, where parents and children can have fun together." The original statue would be unveiled on November 18th, 1993, on Mickey Mouse's 65th birthday. And since then, 4 more partner statues have been built. One at the Magic Kingdom, one at Tokyo Disneyland, one at the Walt Disney Studio lot in Burbank, and one at Walt Disney Studios Park, the only theme park that bears his full name, and the worst Disney theme park in the world. Today, though, the tributes range from not so touching to utterly bizarre and sometimes downright offensive. In recent decades, Disney has moved from treating Walt like a real person and instead treats him more as a character, one used to sell merchandise and memories. One of the first things that started moving him towards a character was the sneaky removal of any cigarettes from Walt Disney's fingers in official photographs. Walking around Disneyland or on any official Disney materials, you will never see a cigarette in Walt's hand, even though he was an aggressive smoker. Disney has since gone in and photoshopped out any trace of cigarettes. This has left many photos of Walt looking like he had a penchant for two-finger pointing, which is where many people think the idea of the classic Disney parks two-finger point that all cast members do originally came from. This was just the beginning though, and in recent years Disney has gotten more and more egregious with their treatment of Walt. Things started out relatively tame, with Disney's misattribution of quotes to him. Things such as, "If you can dream it, then you can do it," have officially been credited as spoken by Walt in multiple official Disney outlets, such as in the Science of Imagineering DVD series, and even on construction walls in the theme parks. The issue, of course, is Walt Disney never said this, and it was originally written as "If we can dream it, we can do it" by Tom Fitzgerald for the Horizons attraction at Epcot Center. The 100th anniversary of the Disney Company also seemed to be a good excuse for Disney to trot Walt out in a variety of ways. First was with the Uncanny Valley Express that is the Walt Disney hologram at the Disney 100 exhibition. Welcoming guests to the exhibit is a holographic Walt speaking a speech which is a combination of 2 historical audio recordings, combined with a CGI body made from AI-enhanced footage from the 1960s. While this is a touching tribute to the man who made it all happen, I can't help but feel uneasy when watching it, and something just feels off about the whole ordeal. Of course, not every tribute this year has felt weird. I'd be lying if I said the moment in Once Upon a Studio where Mickey spoke to Walt didn't make me tear up. It was simple and touching. Even though Walt didn't move or speak, he felt like more of a real person than the hologram does. While the partner's statue was the original and for years the only statuified Walter, in the last decade or so, more and more new Walt statues have been added to the lineup, with each feeling more and more forced than the last. The next statue to come was Storytellers, designed for Disney California Adventure. This statue depicted a younger Walt Disney as he arrived in LA back in 1923, joined by a Mickey Mouse from the 1930s. This statue made sense for the rededication of DCA, but has since been replicated randomly at Tokyo Disney Sea and Shanghai Disneyland, which doesn't make sense. Recently, Hong Kong Disneyland has also debuted its own exclusive Walt statue entitled Dream Makers. This one showcases a slightly older Walt looking over Cinderella Carousel. This is a nice tribute as Walt famously dreamed up the idea for Disneyland while watching his daughters on a carousel. However, Walt had nothing to do with Hong Kong Disneyland, and the story here seems forced. The most unfitting and egregious statue, though, has to be Walt the Dreamer, which is coming to Epcot. This will showcase the oldest Walt of them all, and Disney will happily tell you how it shows the time of his life when he was dreaming up the initial concepts for Epcot. But Walt's plans for Epcot were the city, not this theme park that barely resembles anything related to the original Epcot plan. This is just another way of using Walt's name to try and sell the idea of something, trying to give it some emotional backstory that is completely made up. And I'm sure I don't need to be another person to point out what the pose resembles. A more fitting tribute may be him overlooking the rivers of America at Disneyland, in arguably this same sitting pose. This is a place Walt was said to frequent in his last days, reflecting on his life and his achievements, when he knew his story was coming to an end. It would reflect a Walt who was still inspirational, considering his works up until his final days, but sharing a problem that all of us will one day face. But instead, they want to slap him down in Epcot, a park that went against one of his last wishes. One of the most offensive and downright dirty uses of Walt was back on the 12th of November, 2021, when you could buy a partner's statue NFT. Limited to 4,333 copies around the world, this digital collectible originally retailed for $333. Since then, though, it has seen itself skyrocket to $49,000 before crashing aggressively back down to its current price of around $1,800. This means that Disney was willing to sell their founder for $1.4 million. Walt Disney is a man countless people, including myself, look up to, and understandably so. The man achieved greatness in his life, but he wasn't without his faults. He was a human, and that's what made his story so great. No person is without their flaws, and Disney's persistence in rewriting Walt's legacy to gloss over some of the less desirable aspects ultimately makes him less relatable, with this near godlike depiction making it harder to capture the very dreamers that Disney hopes to inspire. Disney in recent years has tried to hide these faults and turn him into characterized perfection, and the more and more Disney sanitizes the true Walt, the less and less people respect him for the true man he was. Over to you. Do you think Disney has a Walt problem? Let us know down below. For Review Time, I'm Luke. Thanks for watching.